Okay, welcome back again. This is part 3 of our lecture going through ancient Egypt and into ancient Mesopotamia. As we're talking about ancient art, I'd like to just to give you a little bit of a understanding of some difference between the world of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. Um, Mesopotamia is the region in the Middle East that lies between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and at this period of time, Egypt and the Mesopotamia region were the two primary areas where civilization flourished at around 3000 BC. And but at the same time, they are quite different from each other. And so one of the things that um, I want to make clear is that I guess one of the major things is that the Egyptian period or the Egyptian society that we look at and then what the art reflects is a society of city-states, but they're city-states that have been unified into large kingdoms, and those large kingdoms were then unified into an even larger kingdom. And so for thousands of years, they didn't have to be defending themselves as independent city-states. They were part of this larger nation. And Egypt was pretty much a nation, a unified people, all the same people. Whereas in Mesopotamia, we have much more independence between each city. It's very much a culture of city-states. Periodically, one city-state might rise in importance and then dominate or even conquer the other city-states, and for a period that becomes a kingdom. But on the whole, this was a society of competing city-states. The first people that we see, and then that's the other thing about Mesopotamia, unlike Egypt, is that it's not a continuous grouping of people. We have new peoples coming in all the time and new languages coming in. Egypt was isolated. It was very hard for outside people to come into Egypt, and definitely extremely hard for forces to come in and conquer Egypt. So Egypt society was in some ways contained hermetically in a container, um, sealed in a box, so to speak, and was able to be more unchanging because of that. Whereas ancient Mesopotamia was porous. There, from Arabia, from Iran, from the steppes, there were nomadic people coming into Mesopotamia all the time. And because of that, we have this sort of shift. But the very first people that we see in ancient Mesopotamia are the Sumerians, and we see a lot of interesting art from them, um, including this piece, one of the most famous pieces, which is the Standard of Ur, which is, we're still not quite sure what its purpose was. It's a box of some sort, and it's got inlaid decoration on both sides. And most people agree that it definitely seems like one side of the box is the war side that shows battles and also the conquest of other people, and then the other side is much more seems to be the peace side with a banquet and showing this, the profits of peace, like the farming and the the benefits of a fertile land. And so that's one piece I want to talk about. The other piece I really want to focus on is these votive statues, because they say something also about another difference between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both societies were very religious. Both societies were funerary focused, but Egypt was more funerary focused. But another difference is that um, Mesopotamia was more piety focused. In a lot of their religious art, um, the the power of the gods and human beings' sort of abject subordination to gods was an extremely important part of what was communicated in the art. This is kind of different from Egypt, where in Egypt the dominance of gods was kind of assumed, but also on the whole the benevolence of God. Whereas in ancient Mesopotamian, the benevolence of any figure was not assumed. Mesopotamia seemed like a much more violent and competitive world. So as I said, nomadic people spread into Mesopotamia, and this is kind of a classic theme of history in general: the tension between the settled people, the peoples who live in cities, versus the nomadic people. And we see it a little bit in some of the tensions of on some of the ideas in Egyptian art, notably the imagery that a city is contained within walls kind of demonstrates that. But in Mesopotamian art, we see that much more. So we have people like the Akkadians, who these were outside people, people who spoke a language similar to Hebrew, so they're described as Semitic people. These people came from the outside and then established cities, probably conquered, Sumerian cities, and then built their culture on top of the pre-existing Sumerian culture. And then the Akkadians became a very important military power. So we have this carved piece, this stele of Nehrim Sin. Actually, the full title is The Victory Stele of Nehrim Sin. And what this is, in case you may be kind of like wondering what the purpose of a work of art like this is, a victory stele would be a stone marker placed in an important spot to say, somewhere near this spot, a major battle happened, and this great king, conquered all these people. We see a similar use of change of scale for hierarchy purposes. Look how large the king is compared to many of the people who are fighting with him, and especially compared to the people who are fighting against him. Um, and this is once again also a great example of low relief, although it is much higher than what we saw with the, see how much more deeply carved in it is compared to the relief we saw in the palette of Nahmer. We also, a piece like this right here, which comes from is a statue of a king called Judea, who was one of the kings of the Neo-Sumerian empire, I guess you would call it. After the Akkadians were eventually defeated, the Sumerian cities kind of made a recap, a restoration of Sumerian culture. And this piece, which there are pieces, many pieces like this. This was a kind of like a mass-produced type sculpture. It would have existed in every major city in their empire, and in every major important temple and administrative building. And you can see some similarities to Egyptian art in this, like the desire to use kind of the solidity of the rock and the solidity of the kind of cubic structure of it, the basic block form of it, to create a sense of it being permanent. But it's also different in a way. There's a little bit more life, a little bit more sense of almost caricature to this figure. It's also a little bit more simplified. The attention to perfect proportions, not as much as in Egyptian art. And then also, this is a very Mesopotamian device to use a sculpture as also a means of recording writing. So the text written on his clothes is actually a description of law. See the same idea here in the Code of Hammurabi. Later on, after the Neo-Sumerian period, we have a period called the Babylonian period. And Babylon was one of these cities, one of these Mesopotamian Sumerian city-states, and that was fought over, and and then eventually became itself an empire. And and Babylon, of all of these, was probably the first true empire where they really consciously decided that they were ruling other peoples, and that the idea of creating an administration to organize different kinds of cultures, different kinds of people, different languages was an important part of their structure. So this is the Code of Hammurabi, which, that's a detail from up there. So this is a form of a stele, but this is actually a law stele where most of it is contained with this writing. It's very, very tiny, and this writing, you can kind of see a little bit more clearly here. This writing is a list of all the laws, the law code of this king. But at the top is this image, and here's the king receiving the law from his god, his deity. And it's a very interesting thing, even though the deity is much larger than the king, because the deity is seated and Hammurabi is standing. They are all, in some ways on eye level to each other. You would never see an image like that in Egyptian art. And that is the end of this lecture. Next, we're going to talk about the